Quick test that you can hear me and see me.
Yep, you're good, Congressman.
All right.
And it looks like we can go ahead and get started. We are at the 2 o'clock hour. I want to thank everybody for coming on, those who dialed in, and those who are on the Microsoft Teams app or in the browser. My name is Jake Bronger. I'm with NFIB. I also have Bill Smith, our state director. He and I are part of our Wisconsin NFIB team. And we also have Courtney Brooks, who is our federal government relations staff member out in the Washington, D.C. area. I will ask everyone, try to stay muted during this call. That way we don't speak over each other. If you have a question, feel free to email me or type your comment into the conversation box in the Teams app, and we'll do our best to get it answered for you. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Bill Smith, our state director in Madison.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you, everyone on the call for participating today. Thank you, Courtney, for joining us, and Jake, thank you so much for setting all this up for our members of the 1st Congressional District. Special thank you to you, Congressman Steil, for joining us today and sharing some remarks and some updates for the small business owners in the 1st District. I'm not going to get into a lengthy introduction here, simply because it's more important that they hear from you. So it suffices to say that we're very delighted to have you with us, and we appreciate you taking the time. I know you've been doing just an outstanding job assisting your constituents with meeting the pandemic crisis. So with that, again, thank you for joining us, Congressman Steil.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody being on the call or on the video chat here today. We are in uncertain and uncharted waters, and it is going to be folks like you in the business community that is going to be absolutely critical in, one, getting us through this, and then two, when we get through this and we start to get back up on our feet, to really be the engine that's going to drive our economy forward, to make sure that folks who have lost their jobs in these challenging times have a job to go back to. And that's one of my big focuses on this. Maybe I can set the stage and walk through from a policy standpoint in Washington, where we're at, what the road looks like ahead, and then maybe open it up and have a little bit of a dialogue with some questions. I would love to hear what you guys are seeing, boots on the ground. So if you go back now about a month ago, when things probably felt pretty normal, Congress passed what I'll call the first coronavirus bill. The first coronavirus bill was focused in on enhancing our testing. In particular, it was a total of about $8 billion. Now a small amount at the time, a pretty healthy amount to our Center for Disease Control and improved testing. The president on March 13th issued a declaration of national health emergency that freed up $50 billion under the Stafford Act for him to allocate in protection of the nation's health. Congress then passed the second coronavirus bill. The second coronavirus bill was addressing, in particular, paid leave for sick workers. The first version of that would not have covered workers, in particular, their health care coverage or payroll taxes, which, as any business owner would know, is a huge portion of the total cost of those employees. And so as a result, we got that amended. To give you a flavor, this bill passed at 1 a.m. on a Saturday. So nothing good happens at 1 a.m. on a Saturday in Washington. And in that, the bill was 110 pages. By Monday, we had a 90-page amendment. So imagine your spouse giving you a grocery list with 110 items and then changing out 90 of those. That's a completely new grocery list. So by the time we got to Monday, we had a better bill that protected our small business owners and our businesses across the nation. Then Congress moved forward as this epidemic continued to develop. We're now in many states, Wisconsin, a stay-at-home kind of operation here that's having a huge negative impact on our economy. Congress passed the third coronavirus bill last Friday. I actually left my home. I'm here in Janesville. I left my home here in Janesville, drove to Washington, D.C., voted on the bill, and drove back here to my home in Janesville. Let me walk you through that bill real briefly here. There's 4 key points to walk away from the bill. The first point is the direct payments to employees. So inside that bill is $1,200 per adult, $500 for dependent children, and that does phase out with incomes. The phase outs begin at $75,000 for an individual, $150,000 for a married couple. The second key part of the bill, which I think is probably one of the most important things here for NFIB members and small businesses across the nation, is the Paycheck Protection Plan, the PPP, if you will. The PPP allows small businesses to obtain SBA-backed loans through regular and traditional lenders. So that means your local bank, your local credit union, right here in Janesville or in Racine or wherever you might be located. That will be the bank or credit union that will be able to issue the loan. The loan, if you follow the steps that are required, mostly maintaining your payroll. There's some nuance, read the details. That's the overarching, is if you maintain your payroll. These loans are fully fundable and paid by the government. So in the end, you're going to walk away not having to pay this if you're able to maintain your payroll through that period of time. There's some details, and I would maybe take a pause here to remind everybody, this is not the time where you want to read your neighbor's Facebook feed to determine what the facts are on the ground. This is where you want to obtain official government information about what's going on, because things are developing quickly. Our website, my website, steil.house.gov, that's steil.house.gov. We have a big link right there on the front page that says coronavirus. Click that. In there, what I've done is collected official links to local, state, and federal resources. So if you want to get the latest regulations that are coming out on this PPP loans from the Treasury, we'll link you straight to the Treasury's website with that information. If you want to get the information from the Small Business Administration, we'll get that. If you have questions about unemployment from the state of Wisconsin, we have links there. It's just a nice one-stop shop to go to. That's steil.house.gov, steil.house.gov. Let me jump back now. The other 2 key points in the CARES Act bill that passed, the second one is loans for large businesses. So rough math, $500 million of loans that are going to be available to large businesses to be able to have them get through these challenging times. Those are businesses with 500 or more employees in total. The final piece of the bill is direct funding to state and local governments, as well as direct funding into our healthcare system, hospitals in particular, and also to make sure that our nurses and doctors have the protective equipment that's required. Now, let me jump out just briefly and make a comment about the importance of the business community in this broader epidemic, and then we can open it up maybe for a few questions and have a dialogue. The business community and American entrepreneurial spirit is what's going to ultimately allow us to tackle this virus. Let me give you a concrete story of how this plays out and how I think it plays out going forward. When this began, I reached out to businesses all across Southeast Wisconsin. In particular, as we identified that we had a lack of protective equipment for our nurses and doctors, and said, if any business is out here that's able to provide this type of equipment, if you need expedited review by FEMA or by a national health agency, reach out. Jockey, who probably is most well known for undershirts and underwear, actually can also make tier 3 medical gowns. These are the gowns that nurses and doctors would wear in a medical setting. They then got expedited review by FEMA, got approved, and then for a stroke of just interesting conversation with a group of businesses, their gating item on the production of this was a plastic sheeting that was actually produced by a Wisconsin company. I got a phone call that said there is a supplier in Wisconsin called Charter NEX, or a plastics company located in Milton. By any chance, do you know anybody there that you could connect us with? It's a small world. That's actually the company that I worked at before I ran for office in Milton, Wisconsin. I was their general counsel and secretary, so I knew everybody there. We called. They ran that product on the night shift immediately. It went from a 4-week lead time. They had it produced by 8 a.m. the next morning, ready for shipment. And Jockey is now producing between 30 and 50,000 medical gowns a week that's going to be shipped all across Wisconsin and across the nation. And so it's the business community that's stepping up and leveraging the American capitalist structure to really ramp up the fight against coronavirus. 2 is on the other side of this. We're going to be in challenging times for a handful of weeks here until we get ourselves wrapped around this idea. Testing is going to be absolutely critical for us to get our hands wrapped around this. You need to know the numerator and you need to know the denominator. But we're going to start to come out of this, and then we're going to say, how are we going to get the American economy revved back up? And that's where the business community and businesses that are members at NFIB are going to be so critical. We're going to need jobs for workers to go back to who may have lost their job during these challenging times. And ultimately, we're going to be relying on the business community to pull our economy back up for what is going to be a very, very challenging few weeks ahead. And so I appreciate NFIB hosting today's event, and happy to be here. Maybe pass it back, and happy to answer some questions from those on the phone or those on the video chat.
Well, and I believe, Courtney, did you have a couple questions from some of our business members, right?
Sure, and thanks for your time today, Congressman. That was a tremendous overview, and we really appreciate it. We had a couple of questions submitted in advance, so I'll go over those now. One is regarding the expanded unemployment benefits. I am worried that the $600 boost in expanded unemployment benefits will cause some employees to turn down calls to return to work once the worst of this pandemic passes. Is there any way to limit the disincentives that this will cause for a number of employees?
That's a great question. Interestingly, about an hour ago, I was on the phone with Kevin McCarthy, the leader, the Republican leader in the House, talking about this exact issue. And so the Labor Department is in the process of writing the rules and regulations that are going to surround what is the beefed up unemployment insurance. And so the regulations, we're going to be looking for to take that into account, that the additional plussed up $600, that there is an incentive for people when either A, their employer has an environment where they can operate and work safely, those individuals have to go back. And 2, that people maybe don't quit a job, rather, that is available to them where they're working in a safe environment. We're going to have to drive this through the regulatory framework to make sure that we get this right, so that we're not negatively incentivizing people not to work who are able to work in a safe environment. And so the law part of this passed due to the speed, but the crux of this is going to be in the implementation and the rules and regulations that are going to come out from the National Department of Labor and then state government entities in Wisconsin making determinations to address exactly what you just identified.
That's great to know. And I can tell you we've heard about that from a number of members, not just in the 1st District, but also across the country, who've been very concerned by that. For another question we have here is, how are we supporting essential businesses and their employees? Do you know if any extra assistance exists, or does Congress plan to address this in the next COVID-19 bill?
Say that first part again, the which part?
Sure, essential businesses and their employees. So for folks in the food manufacturing and distribution industry, first responders, and other indispensable industries in the medical field.
Helping them out in the sense that so maybe let me step out. There's some businesses that are obviously devastated by the coronavirus and the stay at home. I talked to employees and business owners at restaurants or at hair salons. They're in dire straits. There's some businesses that are actually doing quite well because of the coronavirus, if you will. So there's some businesses in Wisconsin that have seen orders come in where companies are trying to move their supply chain domestically. There's a manufacturer that I spoke with just this week in Franklin, Wisconsin, whose major competitors are abroad. And his buyers are actually interested in bringing their supply chain back to the United States, and he's actually doing, from a business standpoint, doing well, and his employees are able to operate in a safe environment, and that business is deemed essential. So maybe I don't fully understand the question of what assistance would be required for businesses that are operating well, but I would note that the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Plan loans, can be obtained by any business that's negatively impacted. It does not require you to be fully shut down. So if your business is 50% impacted, you would still be eligible to apply and obtain a loan for that 50% of the loss. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to cover the 50% that's not a loss because you're up and operational.
Gotcha. That's helpful. Thank you, sir. And speaking of that Paycheck Protection Program, there's been some press reports recently that there might not be enough money. If that's the case, do you think Congress will revisit that and make sure to bolster that program so that all small businesses who are eligible are able to get that loan?
Great question. I've read those press reports and talked to a handful of people in the financial community that some believe that'll be the case, some believe it won't be the case. We are, as I said at the beginning, we are in completely uncharted waters. I don't know of any economy that's voluntarily shut down huge chunks of their own economy voluntarily. And so we're going to learn a lot as this program launches. Anytime you do a program of this size and magnitude, there's going to be some challenges coming out of the gates as these loans become available on Friday. Not lost on anybody that it's going to be probably a challenging day. We're probably going to learn a lot, and Congress is very likely going to have to come back and revisit pieces of this. And the administration is going to probably have to put out additional guidance as we move through this. My focus on what I call the fourth coronavirus bill, so the next coronavirus bill that we do, is that we have it very fact-driven and it's very specific to address the problem. And so one of my big concerns, one of my concerns with the CARES Act, the third coronavirus bill, is that there's individuals that look to get sweetheart deals inside their bill. And so that happened last time. I don't know if you've seen, I've talked a lot about this $25 million that got snuck in for the Kennedy Center, a theater in Washington, D.C. We need to be fact-driven and specific. And so if Congress see that this first $350 billion is woefully inadequate, or we run out, I trust that Congress is prepared to act again. But we're going to have to do this in a fact-driven way. And admittedly, we're in uncharted waters, and we're going to learn a lot over the coming days about how this program is working. And I'm optimistic it'll work well for one of the most challenging times we faced. But where it doesn't work well, I've talked to my colleagues. I think everybody's prepared to act to make sure that we're protecting our businesses, in large part because people who've lost their jobs are going to need a job to go back to as we get back up on our feet.
That's great to know. And you're absolutely right. I appreciate the reassurances that you guys have the eye on the ball and you know what's going on with that. We have Linda from K-Town Transportation who has submitted a question. Linda, would you like to ask the Congressman directly your question? If you press *6 to unmute your line. We'll give her a second, and if not, I'll just read it. All right, I will move forward, and Linda, if you're able to join us, please do. Her question is this: when the loan for the PPP loan, when the loan is distributed, is that when we count our full-time employees? So say, for instance, we have 14 full-time employees, and if we keep all 14 employed for the 8 weeks, will my payroll be forgiven, or will the loan be forgiven?
There's an answer to that, and I don't know the answer off the top of my head. But what I would advise you to do is to go and review the Treasury guidance that does have the answer to that. So there's a lot of specifics in there. One of the most obvious one is, how do you count payroll headcount at different businesses? What is your average wage that you're paying, et cetera? There are answers to that. The best place to go is your local lender. So the lender that you currently use, your local bank, your local credit union, they are the people that are going to be, one, instituting the loan, and two, they are receiving real-time advice from the Treasury and the Small Business Administration. That's the best spot that you can go to get that answer. I guarantee you they have that answer. off the top of my head. I don't know it, but I want to make sure you get the official advice. You could go to my website, steil.house.gov. We have links to the SBA and the Treasury that may have the answer to that. But I do know your lender, your local community credit union, your local bank does have the answer to that when you would go and file the application for your loan.
Terrific. Thank you. And Linda, hopefully you got that. If not, I'll make sure to follow up with you after. Are there any other questions is there any other questions for the Congressman? Congressman, how are you and your family? Is everyone safe and healthy?
Yeah, we've been lucky in my family. Everybody has been safe and healthy through this. You know, we're all doing our part. I'm a young, healthy guy, but I'm doing my part because you don't want this to spread, particularly to the more vulnerable amongst us. I have a 95-year-old grandma. I drove over to her house the other day and waved at her through the window just to say hello while I talked to her on the phone at the same time. But my family, we've been blessed, but that is not the case for everybody across our state and across our country.
Well, we're glad to hear your grandmother's doing okay. And that was the responsible thing to do, to away from your car.
Right.
But I have one last question here, it looks like. And you addressed this a little bit in your comments. Secretary Mnuchin has referred to the passage of the CARES Act, this last bill, as the third inning in a 9-inning game. The ink is barely dry on CARES, and we understand that. But moving forward, how do you anticipate Congress will respond? Do you think they'll take stock of what's worked in the CARES Act and try to build on that, as we referenced, if this PPP loan needs additional funding, or do you think they will pivot to infrastructure?
So this is one of my biggest concerns. Is I totally agree. There's going to be additional bills going forward. I don't know if it'll be 9-inning game or a 5-inning game, but for sure there's additional pieces of legislation that are going to come forward to address concerns related to coronavirus, appropriately so. My big goal in this is that we're fact-driven, that we're not spending money frivolously, that we're spending money on two key things: to make sure that employees who are impacted by this through no fault of their own are able to receive the resources that they need to be able to pay their rent, pay their mortgage, and cover their grocery bill. The second thing we need to do is make sure that we're addressing the coronavirus itself, making sure our nurses and doctors have the resources that they need. My big fear in all of this is that individuals will try to use the crisis of the coronavirus to try to implement broad, unrelated policy objectives. I think we need to be very thoughtful on spending going forward. There may be aspects where we need to help kind of stimulate the economy, but this is not a time where not a time, in my opinion, where we should completely break the piggy bank. We're $23 trillion in debt at the start of the year. We projected a $1 trillion deficit. We just spent $2 trillion on top of that, and very likely tax revenues are going to go down very significantly. I think we have to be prudent and thoughtful of additional spending. But currently, you're going to see a lot of ideas come out on the table. And then the next bill needs to be kind of laser focused. And that's where the feedback of folks on the phone call today is so important. Have that communication with my office, with the leadership at NFIB, to make sure that we're getting this right, because it can very easily not be done right. As you saw in the second coronavirus bill, some of the structuring that was in place for paid sick leave had very significant cash flow impacts on small businesses. I was one of the few members that voted against that bill because of the cash flow issues in the initial version of that bill that came before the House. It's critical that we get these things right in such transformative legislation, and that we don't use this crisis for people who want to obtain broader policy objectives not related to fighting the coronavirus and protecting workers.
Courtney, before we conclude, this is Bill Smith, Congressman. I have a question about the liability provisions of Coronavirus 3. I know there is some immunity in that act, but going forward, and it sounds like Corona 4 is inevitable, that it will be coming forward. Are there any discussions concerning liability issues on the part of the providers, on the part of employers, on the part of workers? I mean, it just seems like the liability exposure and the expansion of liability is going to play out if we aren't very careful about addressing it at this time.
Bill, it feels like it was years ago that we met up at one of your member businesses in Racine County. Good to hear your voice. I think you're spot on the importance of liability. There's been conversations on that. I think we're going to have to be looking at that in the fourth coronavirus bill. That maybe goes back to my point of making sure that the future legislation is very fact-driven and that we're analyzing this correctly. I'd have to go back and think about that a little bit of what was in the previous bill and how it may impact businesses. We're stepping up to the plate in expedited fashion to make sure that they're protected from their efforts in trying to address the impact of coronavirus, in particular those that are producing PPE. But that I would love to maybe chat offline with you. I bet we could get in the weeds about what's needed in the fourth coronavirus bill to make sure that businesses are encouraged to accelerate their production, in particular of PPE, and to make sure that they're appropriately protected from liability, as well as what's going to occur when we reopen the economy, to make sure that businesses are doing what's safe for them and their employees, but also to provide appropriate protections. I bet we could have a great conversation offline. I appreciate bringing that up, Bill.
Okay, thank you.
Congressman, another question I wanted to get asked was, and of course, this is going to ask you, I mean, we understand that you're not the scientist that's predicting all the data models and stuff, but obviously a lot of our members want to know or hoping to know when they might be able to start reopening their businesses. Is there any type of process or rollout that you are hearing is being discussed about certain operating procedures that they could start to expect and maybe when they could expect those?
It's a great question, Jake. Let me explain it this way. So one, the most important thing is that decision is exclusively in the hands of Governor Tony Evers. For those of us here in the state of Wisconsin, that anything related to what is an essential business, to what businesses are allowed to operate, to when school begins, under Wisconsin law, that is in the hands of Governor Tony Evers until future notice. But if we kind of look a little bit into that crystal ball and say, how does this logically play out? The most important thing we need to do is ramp up our testing. I don't think anybody's satisfied with the level of testing that we're at now. But as a go-forward basis, what we need to do is dramatically improve our testing. We don't fully have our heads wrapped around the numerator and the denominator of this problem because we have a very selective test group. You only get tested if you meet certain criteria. We're not doing random sampling across the United States or across regions. As our testing capability ramps up, and it's in the process of ramping up quite dramatically, what we're probably going to see, can't guarantee, but probably going to see, is that there's areas of hotspots right now that's obvious in New York and other locations, but there's also very likely areas where there's not a hotspot. And as we get our hands wrapped around this stay-at-home period is buying us time for our technology to ramp up, for our testing to ramp up, that we can then start to identify where we're able to reopen. And so the likely scenarios we start to reopen in a very piecemeal way. That areas that are outside of hotspots are going to be identified first. Operations that are safe, where you're able to maintain distance, are likely to be first. In my previous job, I worked for 10 years in manufacturing in the state of Wisconsin before I ran for office. And I spent a number of years at Regal Beloit Corporation. They have large operations in the Milan area. And so at the beginning of this, going back about a month when Milan in Italy got hit first, I was on the phone with some of my colleagues just kind of discussing what they were doing and seeing. And it's a little bit of what we're seeing here in Wisconsin is a lot of the businesses in the manufacturing in the Milan region were coming up with quite creative approaches to make sure that their employees were able to operate in a safe manner. We're seeing that same creativity in Wisconsin. I was on the phone yesterday with carpenters all across the state of Wisconsin and what they're doing to try to maintain safe work environments. And so it's very likely that after we buy a little bit of time, after we ramp up production of PPE, as we ramp up our testing, that we're going to be able to identify and kind of piecemeal reopen the economy. And that's going to be critical but that's weeks away. That's not days away. And then it's going to have to be very data driven. This is not something where we can go in broad brush and kind of guess, gut check how we should do this. It's going to have to be data driven. And that's why the testing is so critical, so we can do this in a thoughtful way so we don't come back to where we are right now.
Well, Congressman, it's 2:30, and as promised, we were able to keep on schedule, which is rare, I feel like. But I want to thank you again for joining us, speaking with our small business members in your district. Again, if anyone has any other questions, feel free to email myself, Bill Smith, Courtney Brooks, and we will be sure to share it with the congressman so that there can be a follow-up on that. And with that, I believe we're all set.
If I can just say thanks to you, thanks to NFIB for the work that you guys are doing. And just to tell everybody again, right, these are challenging times, uncharted waters, but we're ultimately going to overcome this, and we're going to overcome it with the American entrepreneurial spirit. And it's the business community that is on this call today that's going to step up for production today, but also going forward when people are looking for jobs to go back to, as we're ramping our economy back up, it's going to be on the shoulders of our private sector businesses here in Wisconsin. And so thanks for what you're doing. But most importantly, thanks for what you're going to be doing as we come out of this and get back up on our feet. So I wish everybody a safe and wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you so much.
We appreciate that.
Thanks, guys.